Hi, I'm Patricia Greenberg. Well, we have all been hearing about how our population is aging. There'll be less young people than people over 65 in the very near future. What does that mean for our society as a whole? With us today is Bradley Shurman. He's an expert on demographic change and how it disrupts social, cultural, political, and economic norms across the United States and worldwide. His deep understanding of population shifts, coupled with his grasp of emerging trends, makes him an authoritative voice in the future of us. He's the author of The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, and the founder and CEO of the strategic foresight and inclusive design firm, Super Age. Welcome, Bradley.
Thanks for having me, Patricia.
So let's start out by you telling us what is the Super Age.
Broadly, it's a UN designation for population. Boiled down to its simplest terms, it's when a population within a given area, that could be a local, regional, or national area, or even worldwide, has at least 1 out of 5 people over the age of 65. It's part of an evolution that goes from aging, which is 7%, to aged, which is 14%, to super aged, which is 20%. It's also an emerging life stage. People are called super agers now. They're people who are older, that are exhibiting higher levels of cognitive and physical function than their peers did just a generation ago.
How did you even come to study this and specialize in decoding or changing demographics?
I was observant, I suppose, as a child. As a teenager, my grandparents went into long-term care. And like most people that get into aging, they were the catalyst. It was a loved one. But it was really my drives between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., which is my adopted home. I was at American University at the time, that I started to see demographic change unfold. You see, the countryside, rural areas, the heartland, are really places that we have to look at as canaries in the coal mine. In fact, I dedicated an entire chapter of the book to this, because these places tend to be older in terms of average age of population than urban areas. And I would pull off the highway and I'd see men and women who looked like my grandparents working in restaurants as waiters and waitresses, in gas stations, pumping gas, and even in rest stops cleaning toilets. And it caused me to pause and ask the question, why? And I spent most of my career trying to decode what that meant, what was causing it. And I found very early on that this wasn't an American phenomenon. This was a global phenomenon. In fact, around the world today, populations are aging. And in fact, birth rates are declining in virtually every country on the world.
Now, where do you go to get your actual numbers on how many people there are in the country, their ages and demographics? I know there's records, but you have a treasure trove.
It's a bit of a trade secret, but we're very fortunate as Americans to have a robust government that collects incredible amounts of data on birth rates, death rates, labor force participation rates, consumer spending. This was all very foundational to the creation of this country. You know, we're one of the few nations, in fact, we were really the only nation at the time when we were founded, that required by law a national count of the population every 10 years. Well, the United States, as well as some countries in Europe, became the gold standard for collecting data on their populations. We know who's living here for the most part. We know how long people live for the most part. We know when they're going to die for the most part. We've taught other countries over our history how to do this as well. In fact, that's a significant part of America's soft power. It teaches other countries how to collect census data. There's also organizations like the United Nations. There's a number of private sector organizations as well. Certainly, we put at the Super Age, we put surveys into the field to collect additional data, both qualitative and quantitative, that help us get a more robust picture of the stuff that's on the shelf. But really, it's not so much about getting access to the data, it's knowing how to read it and knowing how to express it in terms that people understand. Because our brains are relatively small. For as many amazing things as humans do, we struggle with big numbers, we struggle with big ideas. So what I like to do is boil those ideas down to their simplest terms, so people can sink their teeth into them and really understand what they mean, not only for them, but for their families and their communities.
There's so much to talk about this, and I have a little aside on that. So, and I'm not trying to jump into conspiracy theories or anything like that. Are these numbers being used against us? And I ask that in a way that we see as people age and technology moves ahead and people throughout your lifetime die, and you reach a point where you're older and you're old school, right? And you think of, oh, I remember when I used to be able to just pick up the telephone and call someone. I remember when I would get a letter in the mail. Those things still exist, but there's a perception that it's gone. So is the population shift and the trend towards everybody getting older, but we are led to believe that youth rules? Is that being done to us?
Uh, well, that's a tough question because it's a multifaceted question. Let me answer it like this. The first is um, things go out of style. That's just reality.
Right.
I don't imagine you rode a horse to work today. You likely drove a car, took some type of public transportation, maybe a train or a subway. I doubt you rode by carriage the last time you took a family vacation. You probably took a plane.
Mhm.
Things evolve, technologies evolve. They do go out of style because they lose their efficacy, but it does take time for them to disappear. Things like the post office are still very important. Things like landline phones, maybe not so much.
Mhm.
Radio, people still listen to, but they're listening more and more on either a mobile device or a smart speaker.
Yes.
Um, we are not led to feel like we're old or out of style. We are, I think, in our own kind of psyche, pushing ourselves that way because we're not necessarily keeping up with modernity. Modernity is driven by change. And young people historically have been the ones that people see as the change makers in our culture. Um, they're not always, though. In fact, a lot of these big changes, a lot of the tech that we see today has been driven by men and women in their 40s, 50s, and even 60s that are pushing for a new way to do things that may be disconnected from that of the past.
The study of the art and the science of aging is exploding. Some think it's cutting edge to live to be 100 and beyond. Where often I speak in the field of geriatrics, I meet a lot of people. I speak at a lot of senior facilities, and they all say, "Well, we're way ahead of you. We saw this coming years ago, and we're prepared for it." Are we in trouble now that the population is aging and less children are being birthed throughout the world? And what do we attribute that low population growth to? Two
Wow.
questions, but
The
yeah.
big, the biggest of the biggest questions. Are we in trouble? The short answer is yes. But it's only a yes if we do nothing to shift our norms.
Mhm.
As you know, in your area of expertise, people are living on average longer than they did a generation ago. They're often living in greater health too.
Right.
That means that when a person retires at 65, they might be able to live another 25 years on average. That's a long time to live in retirement. That's a long time to live without work. So, part of what modernization means, leaning into modernity, is that people have to work for longer periods of time. If they don't, what happens is we have a mismatch in what we call the dependency ratio,
Mhm.
meaning that too many people are out of work and too few people are working. The first problem with that is that too many people are pulling down on federal programs and state and local programs like Social Security, Medicare. The second problem is people aren't paying as much tax because they're not working. So they're not paying an income tax. The third part is they're not active consumers. The second somebody leaves work, their consumer behaviors change pretty significantly. And the fourth, and I think probably the most important one, is that you start to see a slip in people's health outcomes the second they leave employment.
Mhm.
So by extending working lives, we can move from a fairly vicious cycle where people get sick, they become financially insecure, they pull out of society, to one in which people stay connected for longer periods of time. So you mentioned earlier this idea of as we get older, are we missing things that were there before that we really valued, like the post office and what have you? Well, in many ways, our future has elements of the past already built in. So, for example, um, for almost all of human history, you worked until you were no longer able to. Retirement is a very modern concept. In fact, retirement as a concept really kind of came about in the 1930s when Social Security was put into place, but the retirement industry really didn't become something people thought of and understood until the 1960s. Well, it's only 2023 right now. It's still new,
It's
even though
very
it's
new, very
in
new.
decline, because I think people see it's not a great thing for them at the end of the day to be retired early and to um, go into a comfortable active retirement, which is what the architects of the modern retirement system promised.
It's interesting you're talking about the living generations as we know them today, from the World War II, also known as the greatest generation, down to the alpha children being born right now, is, a wide, very, very wide age span.
Mhm.
And why did 65 become the mandatory line of demarcation?
There's no good answer for that.
Mhm.
Because you reach back into antiquity to find the answer. And in fact, it was during the Greco-Roman period where the number 65 became really the default for exemptions from civil service, going to jury duty, maybe serving in war, within religious institutions, fasting during high holidays. 65 has always been that number. So when we got to the 1890s in Germany, when the first pension was put into place, they landed on 70 as the starting line for retirement. We landed on 65. So we actually kept with a historic norm. But here's what changed. All of a sudden, thanks to scientific innovation, thanks to improvements in hygiene, water safety, food chain, um, even social welfare, people didn't have to go into factories and fields when they were children anymore. They stayed in schools. We improved the infant mortality rate significantly and the youth mortality rate. Prior to 1900, children had a 1 out of 2 chance of making it to adulthood. Today, it's more than 9 out of 10 chance of making it to adulthood. So when there are more people who survive into adulthood, there's a greater chance you can survive into old age. The boomers are really the first generation that has survived into old age, and
Yes.
I'm using quotations here, 65 plus, en masse. So the total boomer population was 76 million people. Okay. Today, there's still about 70 million boomers alive. That is remarkable.
Yes.
That is remarkable. And that really, to me, people say, what was the greatest achievement of the 20th century? Oh, we got to the moon. No, the greatest achievement of the 20th century is that we enhanced human life.
Mhm.
We gave more people access to life. And that is really just an astonishing feat. Now, of course, at the same time, we did see a dip, and we have seen a dip really since the 1760s in birth rates. That's been a fairly consistent decline. And it pegs with industrialization. Every time there's been a massive leap forward in terms of science and technology, we see the birth rate dip a little further.
Yeah, and I was going to talk about that a little bit, and of course, with modern methods of birth control, and also the lifting, if you will, of the oppression of women having to stay home and have children. Now women
Sure.
have a choice. I always like to throw this in, Brad, for both of our educations, if you will, is
Mhm.
I graduated high school in 1978. And then it was still okay if you wanted to get married and have a family right out of high school.
Mhm.
People did go to college. Some people went to vocational school. Some people went straight to work. I'm talking about men and women.
Sure.
My sister graduated high school 6 years later, and by then it was absolutely unacceptable not to go to college. So you see,
Yeah.
in that very, very short period of time, when I graduated, it was perfectly okay to get married and have your children at 19.
Mhm.
And I did go to college, but some of my girlfriends didn't, and they went straight into having a family. And by the time my sister graduated, that was unacceptable. I mean, that's how short that was in the course of 6 years.
Mhm.
So you see that women said, I don't have to have a child. I don't even have to get married. And if I want to have a child, I don't need a husband to do it.
Mhm.
That has a huge impact on population growth.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, but everything goes through cycles. That's the important thing to
Mhm.
remember here. So it is possible, if the economic conditions, the social conditions realign in some way, that we may be going back to the old school way of living.
Mhm.
In fact, since 1971, there have been really two prevailing trends in the shift of the way people live. Multi-generational, multi, generations living in one house. That's been on track to increase every year on year. Now, why is that happening? Okay, from my perspective, it's not because people want to live with their families. Some do. Some people want to live with extended families, but there's a more prevailing economic reason for this happening. The first thing is housing prices have gone up exponentially since
Mhm.
1965. At the same time, the education costs have gone up exponentially in that period of time. On the third part, the healthcare costs have gone up exponentially during that period of time. What has not gone up exponentially during that period of time? Salaries.
Right.
Salaries have not gone up. So there's these pressures now that families face that they didn't have to face in the 1960s and before, even in the early 1970s, when there was a greater opportunity, if you will, to live in a nuclear family. The
Mhm.
nuclear family is going extinct right now. So you have on one end multi-generational housing as an increasing trend. On the other trend, you have a significant increase in single family households, or one person
One
households.
person household, right?
It's the nuclear family that is becoming extinct. But the
Mhm.
nuclear family, much like retirement, was a really short-lived experiment. Um, the multi-generational housing, I think, is a net positive, for the way we operate as a society. But there will be industries that are hurt. Of course, housing will get hit hard if more people are living under one roof.
Mhm.
That's a big one that will get hit, and that's a big driver for the economy. On the other hand, single person households, have more risk associated with them. So those people that are living as singles without children, well, they have to take different precautions in place to build better resilience for later life that a family that's living with,
Yeah,
half a dozen, 10 people in one home won't have to do. They won't
that's
have to
right.
consider those realities.
And I love generational living, which we actually do in my house. The kids are always back. We have one kid living with us. We had my mother-in-law. She lived to be 103, and we kept her in the house with us. And I thought it was a beautiful experience for the kids and for us and for my husband to have his mother with him until he was 70. That's unheard of.
It
That's
is.
very special. My guest today is Bradley Shurman, CEO of the Super Age and author of the book by the same name, The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. Bradley, I did a little homework here, and I see the bulk of our population is the baby boomers too, also known as Generation Jones. I don't know if you've heard that term yet.
I have.
Okay, Jonathan Pontel, one of my dear friends. And it's a subgroup that was born between 1956 and 64. I fall right in the middle.
The disco generation, right?
That's me, yes. And they are completely redefining what it means to age and to retire. And how is this changing the face of what it means to be old? I'm asking you the science and also your opinion on that, because I understand now the most resistant group of people in the United States to getting old or aging is people who are about 60, 61, and 62 right now.
Mhm.
1959, 1960, and 61.
Madonna.
Madonna.
Yeah. No,
Madonna.
you're absolutely right. So here's what happens. So if you think about life as a tree, I think that's an easy analogy for people to wrap their heads around. When you plant a seed that becomes a tree, all seeds look the same, much like we do when we're young. But as we grow, much like as trees grow, we develop personality and character. Some die at a certain age, others become stronger with age. I think we can apply that to long life too. When you meet one 60-year-old, you've only met one 60-year-old. When you met one 70-year-old, you've only met one 70-year-old. And, as we were talking before we began this recording today, You see 70-year-olds running marathons today, and that's quite normal. You also see 70-year-olds in nursing homes.
Mhm, mhm.
And there are plenty of people that never made it to 70 in the first place.
Absolutely.
So, yes, this group, this Generation Jones, is starting to rethink things already. I'm a Gen X myself. I'm a
Okay.
later Gen X. And in fact, I fall into a subgroup that was defined a few years ago as the Zennials. And
Mm.
we're this tiny little generation that overlaps between the millennial generation and Gen X. And
Okay.
what makes us unique is that, and why I think they carved us out as a subgroup, is that we lived harmoniously as children with both analog and digital devices. That's what makes
Interesting.
right.
Okay.
So we're
Mhm.
so we're the great translators of sorts, of technology, and we've been able, we grew as latchkey kids. We were always problem solving between, both analog and digital worlds. But I think that generations are a great marker. They become less valid the longer you're on the planet.
Mhm.
So you have these generational markers, right? But your life experience, your life events, your economic situation, that ends up trumping that at the end of the day. Sure, those cultural touchstones are very important. Did you listen to the Bee Gees? Do you remember, the Iran Contra affair?
Right.
Where were you when Reagan was shot? Like, you can remember all these things as touch points, but they're less important later in life. And that's why there's a growing number of us that are really pushing in our businesses, like the super age, for people to think more broadly about marketing to older populations. They're just exploding right now in terms of size, but businesses in particular keep saying, let's segment 65 plus. The 50
Okay.
plus is a really important demographic. That's really problematic. Um, the more we're able to shift into stage-based marketing, that idea that people live in different stages, have different realities, somebody who's a new mother at 50 versus a grandma at 50 tells me a lot more than if she's 50.
Right.
And the same goes through for people that are, much later in life. There's this great, wonderful story about a couple that just got married. They were high school sweethearts. They were planning to get married when they were kids. He walked away at the altar, and 60 years later they get married. Like,
Wow.
these are more telling stories about what people's lives really contain. And, one of the biggest drivers, which I think is often overlooked, although it really does define who a person is work. Are you working or are you not? Especially in the marketplace, because if you are, you're far more likely to be an active consumer. You're far more likely to be healthy. You're far more likely to be engaged, have purpose, greater levels of physicality, cognition, mental health. That tells me a lot more than, are you 65?
But, this opens up a very interesting conversation because I often talk about in my work, which is aging well, meaning
Mhm.
doesn't mean you're walking, you don't require the walker. And if you do require the walker, it doesn't mean you're not aging well, right? But
Correct.
I tell people, if you open your mind and you learn new things, it's extraordinary what you can take on over after 65, after 60. And you can fall in love at any age. You can pick up a new hobby. You can learn a new language. You can take on a new job. Hopefully someone will hire you. And so you're making a very profound thought on what, put two 50-year-olds side by side, two 60-year-olds side by side, and maybe two 80-year-olds side by side. And the 180-year-old might be a little more compatible with the 50-year-old.
Yeah, Patricia, it was about 20 years ago that this aha moment really came for me. And it was when I was at ARP. We were just starting to really dig into segmenting 50 plus in a more holistic way. Because up until then, I would say, even for most organizations now, they treat 50 plus like a sledgehammer.
Right.
Boom, there's 50 plus. Boom, there's 65 plus, and they move on. But we had convened about 20 years ago now, we had convened a roundtable, focus group of women. And that's where this aha moment really came. Was we asked about family status, and we had, with 50-year-olds in the room, mothers, grandmothers, women who were still single, had never been married. And it really taught a more robust story of what life was turning into. When my grandparents, who were both born in 1914, when they followed their life course, it was pretty much prescribed. You're married by your 20s, you had kids by your 30s. you all retired around 65. That was your life course. That's what you did. But that's broken down now. It's not unusual to meet a new mother in her 50s now.
Right.
It's just not unusual anymore. That would have been unheard of as a norm 10 years ago. And we have to take that as reality. And now we have to figure out what to do with that reality. But making culture change, getting organizations in particular to understand that shift is a barrier, because we are built with bias. We are built in with bias about what older populations should look and should feel like.
Which brings me to my next question, Bradley, which is ageism.
Mm.
And ageism is still alive and well. Many
Mhm.
segments of the population have really fought back and have, forced us to confront the treatment of minorities. And we don't have to go off on those tangents because I think we all know what they are.
Mhm.
What I see, is age-related bias within us. I think you totally agree with me on that. And many of us hate the thought of getting old, so we unknowingly participate in this prejudice. Tell me your thoughts on this.
Um, mm, I kind of sit in multiple buckets here.
Mhm.
I have a lot of different views on ageism. I think there is kind of almost a monotheistic view of ageism that's out there that says, everyone's ageist. And there is some truth to that. We all hold some bias, negative bias towards people who are older than us. It might be well below the surface. It might be upfront and in your face. We all hold something. That's the kind of the monotheistic view of it.
Right.
I think there's a more nuanced view to it. If you're really ageist, you're biased against somebody because of their age. A lot of ageism, as it's perceived within the workplace, for example, comes down to budgets. You might cost more, and it's perceived as ageism when the cuts come, when age may have nothing to do in that decision. Um, on the other hand, hiring practices in particular are often rife with ageism, in large part because people look at a candidate, they may say, oh, they're going to be too experienced, or they're going to be too expensive, or why would they want a junior role when they might be older? Those are all kind of ageist type behaviors. There's a large degree of lookism that comes into play with ageism as well. And I think different people have a different perspective on this, but I think that life and I think kind of people in society in general kind of all rotate around the mean of a bell curve. Okay. So there's an average that sits right in the center, and people who are kind of right in the center of that bell curve, the way they look, the way they speak, their cultural competency, their work abilities, the way they look and present, if they sit close to that center, the less likely they're going to be discriminated against.
Interesting.
Okay, this is my own theory.
Mm-hmm.
The further you're away from that, the more likely you are to be discriminated against. And that goes for every type of ism that exists out there. But with ageism, it it goes both ways, especially in a workplace environment. Young people are discriminated against, older people are discriminated against. It's those people in the middle, those people who are 35 to 45, who rarely face any kind of discrimination in the workplace because they're the median age of the country.
Reading your book and your work, a lot of times I feel like I'm reading myself. I agree with you on so many points. Something you mentioned, and I'll say it and we'll talk about it because this is really, really important. Stop saying because you forgot something, you're having a senior moment.
Yep.
I lose my keys all the time. My glasses are on my head.
Mhm.
I've never been able to find my keys or my phone. It's an ongoing joke. My husband says, I don't know what I do with you. I can never find either one of them. And they're in my gym bag, or I left them in the car, or they're in my,
Right.
my dresser drawer because I got undressed so fast and threw it down and can't find it. That doesn't make me a candidate for having dementia or cognitive decline. But because we say that to ourselves, that's the first place we go. The first place is, oh my God, I forgot something. My memory's not as good as it is. And I want to bring up multitasking. I've researched this extensively. I have a chapter in my book devoted to this, talking about habits we do. It is not a badge of honor to multitask. It is
Correct.
very unhealthy for you. And it's one of the key factors in preventing cognitive decline is being focused.
Mhm.
And I want to mention that you can be laser focused at any age.
Sure.
And
The,
I bring
the,
that up because I wanted to ask you, like, does this
mhm.
come down to the survival of the fittest? People who are more capable of being focused, or people who are more disciplined, if you will, in their lives, that they get up the same time every day, they do exercise, they put a lot of work into both their professional and their personal lives, are going to fare better because they just are predisposed?
Uh, I'm not sure if I would frame it quite that way.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think that people have a better chance at longevity if they're more connected to a purposeful life. I do think that there's some discipline that comes with purpose. You can, like you say, focus on a task. I like learning tasks. I like learning things. I'm naturally curious. So my discipline is knowledge. I like to dig and dig and dig until I have an understanding, and then dig some more before I feel comfortable even speaking on any topic. Um, I do think that discipline plays a role. I do think curiosity plays a role. I do think purpose plays a role. I think relationships are really, really important. And I think the data now is starting to really show that relationships play a highly important role in our success rate and longevity. In fact, I think it was about 2 weeks ago now, Harvard released the findings from a study that's been running for 85 years on relationships and the importance of relationships, and showed that they play a very large role. I also think there's a growing understanding of the role faith plays
Yes.
in longevity,
Mhm.
and this is an interesting one, because we live in a society, Western society, where religion has been in retreat for some period of time. Folks have turned away from organized religion. Um, the question I'd want to ask next is about spirituality. Do you feel spiritual? Because there are people that feel spiritual, obviously, that aren't necessarily connected to um, uh, organized religion. They might find spirituality in their yoga practice. They might find spirituality in meditation. There's plenty of ways you can be spiritual without being religious. So I think, what the takeaway, if I'm going to give you a takeaway here, is that we are in a period of understanding right now what real success looks like in long life. When we take a look back at history, um, you can see that there are kind of key indicators that are illustrative of who was able to live long.
Mhm.
Um, Michelangelo, he was finishing the Sistine Chapel when he died at 88. Well, why did he make it so long? Well, he was a strong man of faith. He was curious. He was an artist. He was active. He was keeping everything working up here. Benjamin Franklin lived to be 84, and Benjamin Franklin isn't known for having a particularly good diet, but
Right.
or being in particularly good physical health,
Right.
quite frankly. But Benjamin Franklin lived to be 84. Why did he live to be 84? He was purposeful. He was curious. He was an inventor. So these aren't necessarily causal. You can't say, well, just because these guys live this long
Right.
doing these things, that's the reason. There are other contributing factors too. But I think assigning one or two is problematic, because people then focus on those and don't take into account the holistic nature of living a long life.
That's the old story. Married people live longer. Married men live
Mm-hmm.
longer, even if you're very unhappily married, because
That's true.
having somebody else in the house, somebody to be accountable to, and somebody that you have to look out for and is looking out for you. And the value of having a pet in the home. If you're living alone, having a
Same thing
dog
with a
or a
pet.
cat, same thing,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. And I want to do a little shout out to senior living. I went to visit someone, my friend's mother, who's in her early 90s and moved into, it's a very she expensive, fabulous retirement home, if you want to call it that. I don't even know what the
Mm-hmm.
right lingo is. We don't want to say old age home. We don't even really want to say retirement home.
No.
Now you can't use senior, so elder living, but active living, and it was beautiful. And I thought, if I found myself alone, this would be I'd be there in an instant, because I just
Right.
can't believe how much there was to offer. I love communal dining. I love playing cards. I'm avid fitness person. I belong to 2 book clubs. I'm one of those people that would love all that.
Yeah.
So, Brad, what do you say? I'm veering off a little bit, but tell me, how would you reach out to a older adult who really doesn't know where to turn and is alone and isn't, what's the first piece of advice you'd give that person to get out back out in the world? I'm sorry I threw you for a loop, but I'm curious.
No, no, I just want to make sure I'm phrasing this the right way.
Mhm.
I think what people forget is that life is a marathon, not a sprint.
Mhm.
And life is also an obstacle course. And
Mhm.
there are times when you're up and there are times when you're down. What makes us different and certainly successful in long life is resilience. I mean, that's a key component to all of this. So when you see people who lose a loved one, um, those that really aren't miss some of the resilience, they tend to leave faster. They tend to die as well in a relatively short period of time. Meanwhile, there are other people that bounce right back. They can fall in love again. They can have another family. They can re-engage with their friends. Um, Resilience is a big component to it. Finding those relationships later in life, though, can be hard.
Right.
Um, and I think it depends where you're defining older. There's a number of different places, community centers across the country that specialize in cater to older adults. They're typically referred to as adult day centers,
Right.
where older adults can go. They can meet with friends. They can play canasta
Mhm.
or checkers or
Mhm.
chess, and maybe experience some really cool programming. There's tons of stuff around public libraries, the YMCA, YMCA's across the country,
Mhm.
community colleges
Right.
are great places to go. You have to re-engage your curiosity. You have to re-engage your um, interest in being more than sad, more than detached, because if you don't have that, you really don't have a will to live, and your life will be shortened accordingly.
Yeah, it gets back to that accountability. Bradley,
Hmm.
let's talk about older adults in the workforce. This is a
Hmm.
hot topic issue.
Yep.
I like you touched upon it earlier, that an older person might be let go, not necessarily because of their age, just because it didn't make sense in the bottom line of the company.
Yep.
But that's the first place we go. Will you let me go because I'm over 50 or I'm
Yeah.
over 60, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Did you see the movie The Intern with Robert De Niro?
I did. I did.
Yeah. So I love that. For those of you listening, I encourage you to watch it, because it's a wonderful story of a man who's older and comes back to be an intern in a firm, and he gets to teach them a few things. And that's what I say. That to me would be the new beautiful model, is having older adults go back and teach the younger people how to manage their jobs. And it may not be a matter of technology. It just might be a matter of insight and experience.
Yeah.
I would like, implore younger people to know that you can learn from older adults. I always say, ask your grandparents, and if they're still alive, stories about when they were young. Learn
Yeah.
about, like you're saying, being open to older people, older people being open to learning about what young people are into. And I think young people need to do the same.
Yeah. So 1950, just following the war,
Mhm.
there were at least one out of two men over the age of 65 engaged in the labor market. By 1990, that had dropped to 14%. And
Wow.
it's only just about one out of five today, even though the number of people 65 plus has exploded.
Mhm.
So I actually hold out a lot of hope because of economic pressures that older people will return to the workforce, and we'll actually start to see the churn that is always historic, the knowledge churn in particular,
Mhm.
restart in the workplace, restart in our communities, because all of a sudden older people won't be shipped off to a nursing home or decamped to Florida for their retirement. Older people will stay fixed in their communities, connected to their families, their churches, their civic institutions, and we'll start to see kind of the natural order of things shift back into gear. This is going to take time.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight. There's plenty of people like to force it today. Good on you. The reality is culture change takes time, but it is happening. And here's what we know. Diverse organizations always outperform organizations that are not.
Okay.
And diversity is everything from race and gender, which are the two kind of primaries, to sexual orientation, gender identification, but also age,
Right.
also age and generation. And what we know is when you have, five generations, what we have now in the workforce, if you have five generations on a team, they're going to outperform other teams because they can identify blind spots. They can think about problems differently. There can be knowledge spillover, which is actually probably one of the best things that can happen, where an older adult who's been on or has worked on these projects for decades is able to say, we tried that. But what happens a lot of time, and this is the negative side of things, if it's not managed correctly, it can become really pejorative. So if the older adult says, we've done this before, and the younger adult says, well, I'm not listening to you just because you said you've done it before. That doesn't mean we can't do it now. What needs to happen in a scenario like that is, we tried this before, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? That's the question you ask them. Why didn't it work? And ask the older adult, the older worker, to help them do an autopsy.
Right.
Line that up against kind of what's modern, what you know now, with it, how the technology's changed, how the techniques have changed, how the consumer groups and the consumer markets have changed, and see if there might be a way to try something old and make it new.
Right. That's a wonderful, wonderful approach.
We're leaning back into a world where people work longer. That's it. There's no debating it. There's no denying it. Social Security becomes insolvent in a few years. That means that benefits will pay out less and less year on year. Medicare will be insolvent in a few years. That means it's going to cost more and more for care out of pocket for people who are 65 plus. And this is just the people that have needs, financial needs. There's a whole class of people who say, I want to work. There's the Warren Buffetts of the world.
Right.
Plenty of people like Warren Buffett. There's plenty of people that own businesses. There's plenty of people that want to start businesses later in life.
Right. And there's
my father's 72. He's still working. My mother's 72. She's still working. They're working because they want to.
Right.
They don't have a financial need. They have a psychosocial need. They want to be connected. They want to be part of something that's larger than them. So, you're going to see kind of both things happen at the same time. Want for financial, want for social. At the end of the day, we're going to build more resilient businesses as a result. Ageism will also start to ebb. It flowed for most of the 20th century. It's going to start to ebb. We're going to have greater respect because we're going to have greater empathy because we're going to be face to face with people who are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, maybe older than us in the workplace.
Right. Really, I can't thank you enough for being here, your insight, your wisdom. When it comes to handling our future and an older adult, top-heavy society, you're really doing great work. And in closing, I want to ask you, what do you like about getting older?
I have not had a year that hasn't been better than the previous one. I am cognizant of the fact that I will experience changes that I won't like. But on the whole, I'll gain more as a result of being on the planet for a little bit longer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bradley Shurman, CEO of The Super Age and author of the book, The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. And for more information, go to www.thesuperage.com. And thank you so much for listening